Thank you all and welcome to this next session of Open Future Forum on funding community resilience. For those of you who are not present for our last session, we just had a phenomenal roundtable of solutions working in the built environment, civic infrastructure, energy, exploring both physical built environment as well as kind of social and wellness contexts. And the very types of projects that I think many of us are looking to resource. And so it's very apt that we're following it with this particular session. I wanted to provide some of that initial context for those who are just now entering. I'm also going to jump in quickly to thank some of our co-conveners for Open Future Forum before we dive right in. So, I have too many tabs here, but we would love to thank our co-conveners, the American Sustainable Business Network, Bluefin Investment, the Eco Restoration Alliance, El Puente, Global Unity, the Guild of Future Architects, Heartland P5, Imagine World, Institute of Ecotechnics, Intergen Family, Kinship Earth, North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, Partnerships for Change, Pro-Social World, Reconsider, Toxic Free Future for Our Children, and the Triangle Foundation, who invited many of their networks together, helped convene content, and made this all possible. And for today's session, I'm thrilled to hand over to our facilitator, Greg Wendt, to lay a little bit more context on the intent and flow of today's session.
Thank you, Katie. Hi, everybody. How's everyone doing? Good. Let's just take a moment to just take a breath. Take a breath and just be present. Take in all the magic and all the wonderful ideas and projects and people that you've experienced. And think about resilience. Think about community. Think about all the different ways that we might hold those feelings. Think about cooperation. And how does cooperation, provide the support for community resilience? And all the different ways that we can approach that. I want to read a little prayer. It's an ancient prayer. I don't really remember which tradition it's from. May the warm winds of heavens blow softly upon our house. May the great presence bless all who enter. May we in our lineage make happy tracks in life. And may the rainbow always touch us, our family, those who came before us and those who come after us. And for me, when I read that today, I was thinking about the earth as this house, and we're all that family. So in this spirit, we're going to look at funding this kind of community resilience from whatever dimension that has meaning for you. And we're going to have a few people share their particular perspectives and projects. And like Katie was indicating, we're going to have a bit more of a dialogue in this session and a little bit more of a sharing and see what emerges between us. So how does that all sound? Sound good? Great. So Katie, I know we have invited a number of people to come, and I thought I would go with somebody I know, but I haven't talked to for a while, who I remember when I met you, Penelope, I had a lot of admiration for your work at Pacific Community Ventures. So maybe we can start with maybe 2 or 3 minutes, because of course we're not going to be able to get far enough along the line here of really getting into the depth, but we can spark these insights and show all the different possibilities in this constellation of ideas that we have. So how do you feel, Penelope? Do you want to dive in and share what you're up to, what's on your mind, and what's your story and what's important for you, what's next, and what do you feel is necessary for this to really be a cooperative effort across the globe?
Oh, I do feel put on the spot. Thank you, Greg. It's nice to see you.
Sorry about that.
Hello, everyone. I see some familiar faces, and I'm very grateful to be here. Pacific Community Ventures feels like a long time ago. I guess to answer your question about what I'm reflecting on and what these wrinkles have taught me, I think the most important thing to perhaps contribute to this conversation is that that I feel stricken. I feel stricken. I feel stricken that that in my beautiful, fortunate life so far, where I've opened many new chapters, that my contribution, however small it may be, feels a little bit like slip sliding backwards. So I do feel stricken. And so I'm very, very interested in any way in which we can increase cooperation, and also absolutely 100% ensure that communities are the determiners of the best future for themselves, and thus have better chances for an equitable future for us all. And so to answer another of your questions, Greg, for the last several years, I've been focused on initiatives that really try to completely upend any traditional sense of investment, what investment is, what it means, what it should look like, and also to really help organizations and others who might be interested to try to think about ways to listen for invitations before we consider investment. I think a lot of the trillions of dollars that have been wasted in the United States, and I think quite specifically they have not been productive, has been because of a combination of not being able to be radical enough about shifting power and decision making to long harmed communities, but also really not thinking carefully about what it means to be invited to invest, as opposed to considering that if you have capital, you must have some form of power, and therefore you may invest. So I guess those are my thoughts. I feel a little disjointed. I wasn't expecting to start this conversation. Thank you all for what may have been a rather inarticulate opening. Thank you.
I thought that was beautiful. It reminds me of the notion of decolonizing investment in a very deep sense of the word. So what is it that it feels relevant to maybe one of the other people that were selected to speak along these lines of funding community resilience, and what have you worked on? Some of that you were invited. Does anyone want to go in next? Jenny, maybe? Jenny, do you want to share a little bit about your perspectives on community resilience and funding?
Sure. So for those who don't know me, I am an attorney. I became a lawyer back in 95-ish, and initially did a lot of work in community economic development in Oakland. I worked on a big real estate project, worked on a lot of small business assistance. And before that, I don't know how many of you know of Michael Schumann, but he is someone who for many, many years, a long time ago, was talking about the importance of communities and localism. And I just, by some total coincidence, got paired with him as his intern before I started law school back in 91. And his whole idea about the importance of grassroots activism and the idea that anything important that ever happens comes from the grassroots and trickles up, that really inspired me and changed the whole trajectory of my life. And that's why I got so into community economic development. But he and I kept talking over the years, and he started really looking at securities law and how the law governing finance in the US can really be a huge barrier to finance flowing to the things that maybe we value the most, and also a barrier to regular folks participating in it at all, in any way. And so I started really working on that issue with Michael, and then ended up leaving the nonprofit back in 2006 to partner with another securities lawyer to start focusing on trying to be the lawyers for radical finance, to see how we could move money to the most transformational projects, to the people that are most left out of finance, both on the receiving and investing side. So I've been doing that for a while now. I have my own law firm now where we do that work, and also have created some ecosystem building projects like Angels of Main Street, Force for Good Fund, Opportunity Main Street, which is a place-based project and support for entrepreneurs based in Baltimore. Also partnered with an organization called Crowdfund Main Street. So just really trying to create those tools and systems and models that make it easier for folks to participate and fund the things that they love and care about, and do it in a way that's fair and just. And a lot of that does involve looking at the models of how investments flow. I mean, there's this very mainstream model that I call the venture capital model, which is based on the demand for extremely fast growth and then some kind of a liquidity event. And even though that space is starting to get more diversified in terms of who is participating, I believe the model itself is fundamentally flawed in so many ways. So I love to see what I can do to promote the idea that there are many, many different ways of creating relationships between investors and investees that can be very fair, just, win-win for everyone, all stakeholders, that does not require that fast growth and the exit where you sell the company to a larger company. So yeah, that's a quick summary of what I work on, but I'm really excited to share any details that I can.
It's really community-driven kind of ethos that you're talking about with the work you did with Conda and CoCap, and which was the local community-driven vision of SoCap, which is, you know, going on. A lot of friends are there right now this week. So anybody have anything that's coming up for you to share? Please unmute yourself and share for a few minutes. And thank you so much. And I think you're still muted, Christopher. I don't know, dude.
I'm
great. We can hear you now.
All right. So hi everybody. I'm Chris. I'm from Australia. This is my topic of my life, so I'm really glad I'm you know, for Katie for holding this in Jamaica and to share. So just my background, I worked in global fund. I was one of those bad guys. I was a global fund manager, investment banker, and I was responsible at one point for the biggest global investment funds in Australia. But I was also very impact oriented, and this topic is vital. And I think that, you know, the key thing is to understand that the 19th and 20th century were built around one big rule, which was scale, making things bigger and dropping unit cost of production. And in so doing, the system gets dumber. As we scale, we lose sight, because to run a big system, you have to simplify. So it gets big. And so you think there's expertise in the scale, but actually there's anti-expertise, because the scale starts teaching people to simplify to meet the demands of scale. And that's, you know, so, and that's what we're here all about. Here is actually to flip that over. So the scale economy got dumber. And so capital, so when we talk about understanding the language of capital, actually capital doesn't understand the language of value anymore, because it actually is looking to simple decision rules and trying to make people fit the simple decision rules in order that the scale system works. And so that's why we're re-engineering, and that's what Web3 is about, and what this whole conversation is about, and why I'm so excited we're working with Open Future, and we're excited to work with all of you about creating a you know, so I completely, when Jenny was talking, completely agree. You know, it's to create a distributed structure about local understanding of value, and so that we can invest in ourselves. And the beauty of this is that big capital will follow, because it now knows it's run out of runway. The crisis has started. You know, real interest rates have been zero for 20 years because there's no real value. So there's all this money that can't get to us, the people. And so they've been printing money to compensate for the fact they actually can't get to the real value situation. But they can't solve it through their structure. We have to solve it. So, I mean, I can go on and on evangelically about that, but there's system design. So we're working with Katie locally and globally about this distributed understanding. Would you invest in yourself? And if so, and that's the problem. People have an idea. They think, is this a good idea? People don't even know how to assess. Am I investable? So unless we can teach people to understand whether they would back themselves, would you ask your aunt, this neighbor across the road to back you? We don't know how to ask each other for help. We've lost that. So it's interesting. I think that villages in the undeveloped world have greater sustainability. You know, the hinterlands in suburbia have been disempowered because all the wisdom, all the powers in the scale economy. So we need to re-empower at street level people to understand their own value and whether we back ourselves and back each other. And then big capital will follow, you know, because, and it's looking for us for the answers. So we're at the tipping point right now for opportunity. I can go on and on and on, but I'm really looking forward to participating in conversations and how we can facilitate each other to solve this problem. So thank you.
Thank you. Emmanuel, I saw you raising you're nodding your head, and now you raised your hand before I. So please share your thoughts and what resonated with you. And
yeah, hello everyone. My name is Emmanuel H. Brown, and my pronouns are he and him, and I am the executive director and land steward for Acorn Center for Restoration and Freedom. And Acorn is a retreat center and a creativity hub in Georgia that is looking to reimagine how we do land stewardship for BIPOC, queer, and trans folks in the South. Yeah, I was nodding my head and I was like, this is the time, because what Christopher just was sharing about the relationship being the place where we can find new pathways to resourcing our best ideas for solutions. We really look at it, you know, one of our core values at Acorn is really this idea about relational economy, which simply says that everything we do is relationships, and our relationships are our greatest assets. And for us, this really informs the groundwork for restoring relationships to land and each other that are actually regenerative, creative, and healing. And those three things feel really important, especially because of the community of practice that my work is rooted in, which is predominantly Black, queer, and trans folks, predominantly those folks who are also, you know, living in the South or moving to the South because they can't afford to live anyplace else, right? And so so it's an internal, you know, I really talk about the work as an opportunity for folks to really dig deep into undoing internalized oppression so that we can create those relationships both across lines of difference and also within our own community groups, so that they are powerful and regenerative. And I extend that to our resource partners, right? So we ask that they have a commitment to centering their resources with communities who have had less access to focus on this type of relationally driven work, right? By now we know Maslow's hierarchy of needs is maybe needed to be put on its side for a long time. Like if we went through that actual hierarchy, then people would not be able to be people. And so really we say, you know, for us, BIPOC, queer, and trans communities, we haven't had a lot of time to be able to focus on our relationships as places of resource because we've been in the turning of survival for so long. And so yes, please let us do that work. And then this has produced for us various practices that I would be happy to talk with folks more about, but one is relationship-based grant making. Every grant I have gotten, I know who the program officer is, who the major donor is. I have sat with them and had an hour-long, at least, conversation with them, except for one in my entire career of doing this work in the past 6 years. So for us, and this also, we bear this out also in our mutual aid work that we offer resources to community with, and then also also by leveraging relationships with funders for emerging and new projects. So I'm very clear that I'm no longer in the place where I need to take $5,000 grants, but I'm going to make sure that the relationships are built for those people who do need that, right? So that they have that. The other piece is slow money. And this is really inviting our giving community from the grassroots, individual, and institutions to be with us for long-term. And long-term for us is 10 plus years. We are a land-based project. We know how slow land moves at times. So 3 to 5 years is not cutting it. So how do you be with us for a long time? And then 3 is increasing our community of praxis, access to resources, opportunities for resource sharing, and experiencing liberated resources. So an example of that for us is we do have a retreat center. In 2023, we'll be offering all the retreats at the retreat center for free. We're going to pilot out, like, what does it mean to have a free retreat center space, mainly because we were able to pay off the mortgage, right? And so for us, we are seeing that as like a pay it forward to the rest of our community of practice. And then finally, just continuing the evolution of how resources are generated, shared, and regenerated. So we have a Building Freedom Dreams campaign that we'll be launching next year that is really looking about how do we reimagine land stewardship for BIPOC, queer, and trans folks in the South to move beyond traditional mortgages to community-held mortgages, to move beyond, to really allow for vehicles. I think a lot of people talk about reparation, and there are not actually a lot of vehicles for reparation to happen. So there are folks out there who have land parcels in the South that are like, listen, I'll give you this land today. And have a nice day. And there's not really a funnel to both do anything with that land and also to train up and skill up and network up future land stewards so that they can hold on to that land and care for it well. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Beautiful stories and great examples of tangible, on the ground community resilience and some of the narrative around the funding component. I know I wanted to call on you, Katie, because you're not facilitating at the moment, but Brandon, you had your hand up before. Did you want to say a few things real quickly?
Yeah, I did lower my hand because I was thinking, maybe I needed a few more minutes to organize, my thoughts. So I wanted to, maybe someone else would go first and I could get circled back in a little later.
Okay, well then come back when you're ready and just listen for whatever the timing is for you. Katie, what are your thoughts around people that are resourcing this kind of activity, and what do you see as far as the pattern that is emerging in the community around you, and what do you feel is the dynamic edge, and what is needed for this community to actually advance cooperative funding for community resilience? What is it that we could all like internalize and use as connective tissue between all of us to make, or whatever else you were going to say. But I think that maybe is the kernel what's on my mind of what I'm most curious about.
Sure. Yeah, I think that connective tissue is a huge piece of it. I will say that, I started my career very squarely in the impact space on one side of being, parts of projects that were looking for funding, and then found myself later on the other side of that table and was working on a venture studio. And part of the impetus for what we're up to with Open Future Coalition was really reaching a point where I was on this very different side of kind of the scarcity puzzle and kind of seeing, well, we have all these resources. Gosh, it feels like if I were to even drop anything within current infrastructures, they're being dropped into a sieve. There was this pressing feeling that all of these resources were being deployed in parallel and in these silos, and that there were all of these foundations that were funding, spending resources in parallel to resource projects, to pay similar consultants, to have similar learnings. They were disconnected from one another. But also I saw a really big gap in kind of non-financial capital resources for projects. There were a lot, I wasn't seeing a lot of the interconnection for knowledge sharing. There's a lot of talk about scaling through capital, but what I was seeing was kind of this temptation towards, I think a lot of what got us into this current puzzle is this runaway scaling without context. And I would kind of argue that a lot of the kernel here is this need for a great recontextualization. You know, it's one thing to say, well, we need to reforest, and so let's plant, you know, shoot as many seeds out of drones as we can and plant trillions of trees. It's another thing to consider, well, what tree is appropriate for this particular bioregion, and what are other people in similar regions learning, and what does it take to tend the tree and to maintain it over generations. And so that was a lot of the gap that I was experiencing, and I wasn't really seeing as much infrastructure as there needed to be to connect that gap. And I would say more pragmatically and kind of tying it into what we're up to now. I know with Open Future Coalition, we started looking at then kind of what some of the non-financial resourcing that we can provide to one another. And I think the biggest part there is one another. Can we create context for shared learning and skill and knowledge exchange so that once we do start dropping in financial capital, we're more resourced to deploy it because we have so much more wisdom with which to make decisions together. But then nodding a little bit to some of what Chris shared as well, I would say now we're right at this phase where we're starting to model some demonstration projects that are bringing in financial capital. And I think one of the biggest challenges we're seeing is that the institutional capital isn't necessarily willing to go and make itself small to go, and it doesn't have the energy, it doesn't have the patience. I think there's all sorts of you know, descriptors we can put there. But regardless of the motive, I'm seeing that the resources are you know, kind of opaque. There's these really big chunks of resource that aren't, you know, it's so much more difficult. It's so much easier to say, well, I have $100 million floor, or I have this, than to go out and really build relationships with projects and help identify some of these smaller efforts. And meanwhile, we have all of these smaller projects that don't necessarily know how to package themselves in ways that are market legible. And so I would say a lot of the work that we're doing is looking at, well, how can we nurture the existing behaviors of these projects? These projects should not dilute themselves or change their missions to chase after making themselves look like what's fundable. But what we should do is give them access to some of those bridges, some of that connective tissue to help those projects doing what they're doing, then translate into existing capital markets so that they can start to access some of those resources. And so I'll just very briefly point to the couple of ways that we're looking at that right now. Happy to go into it in more detail later. But one, we've certainly been looking at kind of expanding upon what Emmanuel shared, more participatory forms of grant making. Let's not look at you know, building standards or metrics from a foundation side. Let's instead look at how do we convene existing communities who know better than anybody else, existing small sort of community lending institutions who know better than any of these big institutions who the projects are within their communities, and provide some of these contexts for convening and participatory project kind of vetting and underwriting and enhancement. Not saying, you know, hey, we don't, you know, this project doesn't win the contest or it doesn't qualify, but instead looking at every project where it is and saying, well, what do you need? What resources can help you become a project that is fundable by us? And then on the other side, kind of looking at as well, how we can help some of these projects kind of package themselves into these more kind of market legible containers. One model we've been looking at is, can you take things like institutional capital and put it into massive kind of revolving loan funds, but then through providing kind of our own sort of underwriting processes, then allow these tiny projects through kind of local networks of these smaller funders, then be able to package all of these groups of projects in aggregate to match them with this institutional capital they wouldn't otherwise have access to. And so those are the main threads we're following right now.
Fantastic. What I hear that was so resonant for me along the lines of our topic today is the notion that there is actually a community not only the community that is receiving funding and support, but the community of all who are concerned about the benefit of the collective, and then looking at how cooperation can happen to do what you said, which is to listen to each initiative and project and identify what is needed most, and then find ways to bring all the different ways of support and including capital, and then coordinate that as a cooperative community. Like the idea that it takes a village to raise a child, and it takes a community to raise a project and make something really happen, and all the different forms of capital, not only money, but all the different forms of money and all the different forms of support. And I know that Tyler, you're going to make a comment, and please love to hear your thoughts, but anyone else has something that would be an example that you're aware of where people are coming together as a community of funders for a particular set of initiatives as a whole, or where it's most representative of that kind of vision. I would love to hear about that as well, and have everyone share a little bit more about the specificity of this kind of truly relational web in the process of funding as a community, funding community resilience, right? So let's get back to that after we hear from Tyler and Brandon, and then I'll ask for more comments. Tyler, please share your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's kind of resonates with what Katie was talking about, where institutions are needing, a certain floor of like $100 million just to move the needle for what they do, and spent a lot of time kind of in that under $100 million type of area. But what was interesting on how the people that came together to make what we're doing happen was to be able to provide the front end capital of hundreds of millions, billions of dollars, based upon a long-term contract of the capacity to process their waste streams. So it was a very innovative way for the institutional side and the sovereign side, as our, we're funded through Sovereign Advisory Group, is to actually go through that kind of debt financing of the long-term asset of the actual trash, of being able to process that, and us being able to invest into the community up front, to provide all that, to create 100% zero waste, zero emissions from a community's waste stream. So the minimum size is about, for 500 tons a day, that's about 200,000 people. So if you think of a community of 200,000 people, that would be about $100 million of CapEx on our side that we would invest in that community. Then you'd have 500 tons a day of renewable materials re-entering that community, creating opportunities with those materials that didn't have to be brought from other places all around the world. So it's exciting, the benefits of circularity, and being able to provide those huge technological and infrastructure plugs within those communities to accelerate it. It's exciting for me.
To help with the circular economy, but also creating economic opportunity and jobs and resilience on the ground with these cities and these places. Fantastic, Tyler. Thank you.
Thanks.
And Brandon, any thoughts along these lines of
Yes.
what we've talked about?
So yeah, what I'm thinking about is, okay, within urban or suburban or small towns, and a lot of these projects give people a higher quality of life. And doing all this work, the people who are making it happen, doing all the research and implementation, need to get paid somehow. Otherwise, you end up being forced to work for a corporation. So with that added quality of life we're offering people through a variety of these projects, that what I've found is in a lot of cases, people are willing to pay for that. What I'm looking at in particular for my pet project, it is to try to bring people together to talk about, how to make sense of current events, how to have inner awareness, civic engagement, meaning making, and there's specialists in each of these areas, but just to coordinate that so that within major cities, there's some sort of circle going on in person, because we're on our screens too much. And that, a lot of times you can work in book clubs and film clubs to help people with these things. it's entertaining, it's inspiring to people, and they are willing, I think, to pay subscription fees or event fees. And that is something, a way to, because it's driven, this effort, these community development efforts, they provide people with that quality of life. And that's ultimately, I think, an important source of the sustainability for this. And that in turn can attract philanthropic investment. It's not just like, okay, well, a lot of these investors or philanthropists, they're thinking, okay, is this going to be sustainable? And that is what I think you can lay out, is to say the people who are being served from this some way or another, they're going to recognize that they're getting a value add, they're getting a higher quality of life, and they're going to be willing to subscribe or pay for events or things like that.
Thank you, Brandon. It brings up the idea of actual places where we can gather and meet and connect in random ways, but also non-random ways through gatherings, and actually providing a sense of community identity and spirit for a common sense of identity, a place. And it reminds me somewhat of some of the work that you're doing, Patrick Doherty, about Places platform, or the idea of really addressing urban sprawl on a national level. But really, I want to hear your dimensions around the quality of the relationships of inclusion to address some of the strife that we're seeing today and so much divisiveness. How does that actual institutional infrastructure provide fertile soil for these kinds of relationships to thrive, and anything else that you feel is pertinent to bringing more collective spirit toward these things that we all know are true for us and important.
Great, thank you, Greg, and hi everybody. I'm Patrick Doherty. I'm based in Cleveland, Ohio, but my projects are mostly on the West Coast in Oregon and California. I'm the CEO of InfraCenters, but I'm also the co-founder of something called Long Haul Capital Group, and I'm a partner in Places Platform that Greg just mentioned. All of that is tied together by this thread of we feel we need to unravel this kind of the urban design imperative that drove the 20th century, that was defined by suburban sprawl. If we're going to address our kind of twin challenges of building a regenerative community and an equitable one. And so what we're trying to do in all of our work is in an economic context, tip the relative price of regenerative, walkable, inclusive communities below the price of sprawl, make sprawl more expensive, and therefore create this kind of market-driven migration into better places. One of the things we're doing there, just to kind of tie the funding, it's kind of this thread that's been going on in the conversation about large kind of institutional money kind of trickling into or somehow getting rapidly into the hands of the communities that need to program them and make their own sovereign decisions. One of the things we're looking at is if one of our projects is $50 to $100 million, taking the debt tranche of that, of the CapEx, and sourcing it from donor advised funds, philanthropic gifts that can then be programmed to get a return, but the return needs to stay within the philanthropic space. And so looking at how principal and interest payments from the debt tranche of any of our projects can then be directed towards the nonprofit ecosystem within the communities that we serve with integrated district utilities. It's the core business that we're in, and thereby start to create a vibrancy in the community life and create the resources for thriving and for self-determined action within those communities that are now being served by a new generation of zero emissions regenerative infrastructure. So those kinds of tools we're really keen on trying to pilot and show how we can reprogram. I think one group identified 750 billion in trapped donor advised funds that are underutilized. We can give that a new life and put it to work with a multiple bottom line. So I'll just.
One of the things that you've said to me in the past was the idea of walkable communities, because if I can walk through my community, my place, then I can interact with people that are also walking. Such a simple, basic concept, which is different than the highway culture here in Los Angeles that I live in. But there's this power of relationship that I think is the underpinning of that, but also, like you were saying, Katie, relationships of all the layers of the process. And then also what you're indicating, Emmanuel, redefining what that we are and how do we define we in this new world context, and what we are now, and how do we come together with these shared passions and shared values to really bond and create the kind of future we want, is the kind of things that I'm hearing, and trying to recap here a little bit in this direction. Katie, I think there was something in designing this session that you saw emergent in the community, and that maybe you can help me define what were the next questions we would like people to reflect on together.
Yeah, I had a thought, particularly sort of venturing from that last session into this one and seeing the faces in the space, that it would be really valuable, I think, we at first heard some initial premises from folks that have been working on the resourcing side, and I'd be really curious to hear now a little bit of a round from those of you that maybe have projects that have been looking to resource yourselves on what some of the specific roadblocks are that you've come into, and do a round of that sort of listening, and then maybe we can do another round of problem solving on top of that.
I love that. So anybody working on specific projects that are indicating what Katie's talking about, anything specific emerging for you, or the one that you're in relationship to, that you're advising or in volunteering or working for? Anybody have specific projects you're working on that represent this? I know, Emmanuel, you've shared some of your work, anything similar to that you're seeing, and maybe, going back to you, Jenny, about what you're doing in Baltimore on the ground on Main Street in Baltimore. Anybody?
Yeah, what I can say is, and it's so interesting because I sit at both sides of the thing as like a funder and somebody who's thinking about solutions about how to move resources and community in different ways. And also, we're a very traditional nonprofit, so we require funding all the time. And one of the biggest things that have come up is this idea about the structures around which we can get funding are so limited and siloed. So literally the difference between a for-profit and a nonprofit venture. And so for many of us who are in this situation, especially those who are connected to land stewardship projects, especially those who are interested in new economy work, are doing both, right? And it feels like we can't say it out loud to anyone, right? We have to go, if people are going down the more social good, social capital investment route, then they can't tell anybody that they're doing anything for free. And then people are going down the nonprofit route, you can't walk into a funder and be like, and also we make money or we build capital in these ways. So really challenging folks who have access to folks who have and are moving resources in either one of those things of what are pools that are going to allow us to tell the truth, especially in this generation of new economy. It's I hate to start a relationship with a lie. I don't want to do that. It doesn't feel like it's a good thing to do. So really just being okay, what is the evolution of the resources that are available that allows the folks who need it and the work that is actually happening to actually be resourced in ways that feel honest, quite frankly, right? And just really breaking down that I have to present myself in this particular fashion. So yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you. Beautiful. And Elizabeth.
Yeah, we're at a very in our breakout session in the morning. We sort of identified how we're at such a pivotal moment in human evolution, really. And the old structures are clearly broken and don't serve humanity in the ways that we need it to. We have a ticking clock in terms of the pressure of our degeneration of our relationship with the earth itself, in terms of the damage that we're causing. The earth has reached its holding capacity and being able to manage what we're doing. She can't take care of us anymore because we're not taking care of her. And the new structures aren't fully in place yet. We know they're needed, and we don't really have time to be wrong, right? We don't have a lot of time to make trial and error mistakes anymore. Like, we need to really start being efficient and effective. And I think for me, the evolutionary imperative that we have is really learning how to do this radical collaboration, like really, really, really learning how to work together. But we don't have containers for that. And and our relationship to the source of life itself is basically dysfunctional because we exist in a delusion of separation. And so without healing those first, those relations, so I really love this conversation, so much talk about relationship, because until we can really connect to those. And so that's been the sort of nexus of where my work is in terms of really looking at how we can not just socially, but also almost like I come to water as the source of life itself. So if we can align with water in our language, in our efforts, and in the way we structure and the way we flow, right? Then we're working with the greatest ally ever. But it's such a strange concept that I've been working on this for 12 years now, and just being able to translate what's in my heart and in my head into a functional model that people can look at and go, oh, I get it. Let's fund that. That's a great idea. and that just that simple block in terms of finding the language that is not too esoteric, but still allows us to communicate the spirit of what we're needing to shift.
Yeah.
Right. So that's really been a challenge for me. And just anybody here that's seeking to learn more about what I'm doing and how might it serve you. I'm really interested in hearing from people and what they need in terms of a organizational structural roadmap to get us in a rapid response to turn the tipping point in the right direction towards life.
Thank you. I think a lot of us resonate with what you're saying in terms of knowing what it feels like and the comfort of finding community where we can talk and all nod heads together, right? So we have, thank you very much, Elizabeth. And Genevieve, what were your thoughts along the lines and some specific examples of the kind of integration that we're talking about and identifying ways to navigate into the unknown together along these lines of what is emergent that you see and what's next?
Well, hopefully my words still make sense. It's getting quite late here in Italy. Anyway, well, I want to say something like before I jumped ship to the kingship Zoom, and because I wanted to listen to John Milton. And that was one point when he was saying, like, and even now Elizabeth was talking now, our relationship with the Mother Earth. If we don't heal the Mother Earth, we won't get anything done. And actually, while I was listening to his words, and that is that this contemplation come to my mind, like with my project in Italy. And that was a vision that came to me to develop this place for children, for a self-sufficient community, could be also a healing center, which myself is, I'm also a Reiki master. And it's like this message come from above, from Mother Earth, is saying, I want this place to be for this purpose, not a luxury resort on a Tuscany hill with luxury or swimming pool, whatever, for the tourists. And it's time that we start to really open up to listen the message that Mother Nature is sending us to do what we need to do. On the way, yes, a lot of difficulties, funding, such a big obstacle, but just keep the perseverance, keep going, and the right people come along. And like, I just joined the kingship on the 6th, and there was a Zoom meeting with Thailand and Jamaica, and today I'm here talking to you guys that I wouldn't have think about it like just 2 weeks ago. So opportunities come up, and just keep working, just keep doing, and yeah, that's
a
it.
beautiful example of what your small project could be, but representative of all these different nodes of different ways of communities coming together. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Deborah.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Well, I'm very thankful for having met Caitlin in Jamaica back in November at the reconsider.org gathering, because I've been on a path of radical collaboration ever since. I have been very much like, I'm here in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm a director of the Institute of Ecotechnics. Mark Nelson is my colleague here also on this, in this forum. And we have been, I feel like I've been an elephant wandering through a desertified savanna for the last 15 to 20 years looking for water. And I have found back to the water, the source of life. We were involved very much with the Biosphere 2 project, which was an example of 100 years of thinking to design a project that would last for 100 years. So to hear people talking about planning for 100 years into the future again is really refreshing, like that drink of water after a long time. We've been working over the years through acquiring land through venture capital, through the for-profit forum, but we have a nonprofit USA organization, a UK charity. And so my challenge has been learning how to shift from the land-based venture capitalist investment to the nonprofit access to all of the funding that I understand is out there. I hear tell there's a lot of resources available for our really cash-strapped owner-directed kind of small institutions. So the ability to tap into where we can, the effort, we are just doing the work. So it's hard to spend the time to stop doing that to raise the funding. So I've been learning, I'm educating myself now about nonprofit fundraising. And so that's been my challenge, yet I see nothing but opportunities. So I'm learning rapidly. And I think that this coalition, Caitlin's financial vision of setting, this kind of banking investment fund where there's shared capital, access to shared capital resources is brilliant. I think education and the ability to communicate to the uninformed is key. So since Biosphere 2, we left there in 1994 for reasons I won't go into now, but we were, at the time that studying elevated CO2 in the atmosphere was not really looked highly upon by certain invested interests. So that private venture went into a different way, but we're circling back around again. And I've realized that people don't understand still what a biosphere is. So biospheric education, understanding biospheric thinking, whole systems thinking is key. So we are turning now to, from doing to really how to communicate these insights. And this forum here is helping to develop that work, and we'll be participating in the media and storytelling session on Thursday, talking more about that, how to communicate, in a way that is that can be digested through through media, films, infographics, how to get across the idea of what is the biosphere, so that people can understand from an organic level the idea that we are nature. And it's my current quandary, and that's really, thank you very much for letting me share that. But my last my mantra on these days has been to persist to resist.
Mhm. Thank you. And what I'm hearing from what you've said and what others have said and what you said, Emmanuel, about the almost schizophrenia of dealing with having to put different faces on in different meetings depending on what the money people want, because they're having particular instructions on what their money is guided toward. It's almost like that old story of 5 blind people coming to an elephant, and one person feels the ear and the trunk and the tail, and they all feel that the elephant is what they perceive because they don't see the whole. And I feel this kind of funding community resilience and funding as a community of cooperation, ideally we find a way that we put, the goal is beyond the goals of the money. It's the goal of the success of true value in every sense of the word, beyond economic value, and then defining the pathway for financial value in that other context. So it's recontextualizing is what I'm hearing each of you say. I just wanted to recap that. And one of the people that I remember meeting years ago who thinks non-linearly in the recontextualizing way is you, Charlie, and I'm glad that you're up next. So maybe a few comments about some specific examples and some specific pathways to address this sometimes irreconcilable conundrum. But please share your thoughts, brother.
The most specific thing I can think of is we have to get rid of this stupid notion of money as something that's real. It is an industrial construct that was created to colonize the earth. The money and the capital and the system that we're talking about right now is not real, and it has lost its connection to the natural world. It is no longer a true coin. As we have this battle between the crypto and everything else, it's no longer there. We created a system to create wealth that was built upon pulling things out of the Earth's natural cycles to create this imaginary property that really, for every dollar we have in wealth, we have a human or a planetary function that is exhaust. And we can see that as we look across our country. My last 10 years have been working with 15. I spent half my life designing beautiful places for wealthy people, golf courses, resorts, doing all kinds of wonderful things. And the last 15 I've spent it working with the poorest, most underserved communities, most diverse communities, rural and urban, around the country. And those people don't get funded. But no one asked them to be born, but yet they have to ask for the money to survive. When do we get over this? When do we get sick enough to evolve that we can move on from this? And I think we've reached that point. My most educational years were sitting on a corner over in the poorest, most diverse part of this town, Kansas City, and leaving here for 10 years and coming back and seeing that in the time that we grew 5 or 6 billionaires, our poverty footprint went from a 5 square mile area to a 50 square mile area of people living off the grid. 45% of the people in this city outside of the workforce, they're not even on the unemployment ranks, but no one funds them, but they survive. 60% of the jobs that are being created in my town right now are being created by immigrants, opening restaurants, opening grocery stores, doing everything around here and really making this place thrive. While the traditional systems getting subsidies of billions of dollars to keep their door open and feed less and less people, and do less and less to grow this community. And, this is happening all over the world. This notion that somehow we're entitled to be given something to have this privilege to do these things. It's an entirely Western phenomenon. It's a colonial phenomenon, not just Western. It was created to justify the taking from another to grow wealth to ourselves. And, you know, we're at this point in time where the ends can no longer justify the means. You know, it's been about 100 years since we conquered every square inch of the earth. And now we've depleted to the point where we can't support ourselves. We've reached that tipping point where we're over. And I sound doom and gloomy, but I'm not, because I have faith in the earth. And I know that it forces us to change when we hit this point, that we've hit this point where we're beyond the blessed unrest and we're starting to grow new systems, and they're coming from places. They're not coming from where that money is trapped. You know, that money was trapped to keep it out of the system, to keep it out of oversight, to keep the community input out of it. Those DAFs were created so that people wouldn't have input on how those tax dollars were spent, so that they could defund the schools, so that they could do these things. How do we change our guidance system to put it back? The systems to move it are there, and they're great. We just have to change the input to get it back. And that is about connecting the people at the ground, wherever they are. There's people changing at all different levels, but it's the connection of the story. We talk about the story all the time, but reality is where the metaphysical meets the physical. And the technology that we're all using right now in this room gives us the ability to do that. Yes, we have to do this stuff in person, but we're at a point where it's time for us to go, and we're all here to do it. So let's go.
So why don't you share? Beautiful. I think we really resonate. I see Jamaica does in the chat. Beautiful. And aside from what you're actually working on that we've talked a lot about recently, what do you see are living examples of the kinds of things emerging in the garden, sprouting, that are not necessarily your work, but other things that you see in the community? There are specific examples of what you think is necessary for the next. Do you have anything in mind that comes to mind to share?
Well, community ownership models are absolutely a must. We've got to figure out how to democratize ownership, because that gives everybody also a responsibility that comes with it to taking care of it in the long term. You know, the community land trust model, I think, needs to be thought of beyond land. Mm-hmm. Let's quit trying to tie the physical asset to it, and let's start pitching in together and owning the movement, because the land is starting to not be the land. Just in my neighborhood alone right now, a third of the houses have sold to out-of-town investors in the last 2 years. So it's no longer going to be the community's property. And we've got to figure out how to get the community into this thing to where it can still be their community in the end, no matter where you are. This is happening all across the country.
So we'll move on to Sushant in a minute, but who's an example of where the most innovative community land trust type of work is happening? Have you seen anything?
The best one I've seen here, and I was hoping they'd be on here, but she had a conflict at the last minute, is we have a place called Marlboro. It's a neighborhood where it started around green infrastructure projects, where they started taking abandoned waterways, and the city was giving them the land and they gave it to the neighborhood. Well, they started doing some houses. The houses wouldn't pay, the gap on the house was too great, but rather than go out and get traditional gap financing, they got a school donated from the public school system that was giving them away, basically, so that they could then take that and do other housing that could offset the money of doing houses in their neighborhoods. It's putting that together. The most innovative ones I see are in food. And it's especially the Latino bodegas, and the fact that, and even Amish markets, where they're buying from their local communities, they're buying from national networks. And you can see this in Chinatown in New York. When I worked with AFI, it was amazing for me to see the food come directly from China right into the stores. It doesn't go through Hunts Point. It doesn't go through the 8 hands of permission that all the other food goes through. They keep these degrees of 2 to 3 separation. It's not even about funding the system, it's about removing the waste. And that's about creating relationships, but it's disintermediating all these gatekeepers that we've created. We've created this notion of value being added by adding hands. Well, no, that's just more exhaust. You know, you've just added more costs and called it value. And
thank you. Thank you. Beautiful. We're looking forward to hearing more from you.
I know we're short on time, so I don't want to hog.
Great. No, awesome. Sushant, what are your thoughts in this regard? I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about these things as well. Thanks, Charlie. And everybody else who's made comments, by the way.
Thank you, everyone. This is such an amazing conversation. There's so many threads here already spoken, so I'll probably try to tie a few of those. Hi everyone, I'm Sushant. I'm the founder of Humantas Smart Planet Fund here in Vancouver. And one of the things that we did in our fund is basically innovate some of the diligence process and investing sort of decision-making process to include system lens, so that we will not just only invest in a company with a technology, but we'll also invest in the solution to the system that they are basically reinventing. Oftentimes we look at problem solution mindset, but underneath there's a system and culture in place. So is a company addressing those as well, right? So we have all of our companies in our portfolio, except for one, I would say, address that issue. So which is really important. But like Jenny said, as I worked on venture capital for some time, the model itself is not capable of having the impact that we want to see in the world. And whenever I come to this kind of gathering, one of the things that I always ask myself is not just who is present in the room, but who is absent. There are so many people here that have not been able to come here today for various family reasons and many other reasons. And I think that's really important. And at the core of it, many of us have already spoken about this, but what is our relationship with nature? What is our relationship with each other? That really matters. This week or last week, we lost a French philosopher, Bruno Latour, who wrote an amazing book called We've Never Been Modern, which basically talked about that as human beings, we're still learning to become this modern being in the world. What does that mean? There are many, there's a move towards indigenous knowledge systems that's been sort of revived now. And I think that's really important to understand that, hey, there are other ways of knowing, other ways of incorporating our capital stack. And so that is my current work, is how do we reinvent capital stack to include those regenerative worldviews into it, to include those new relationships into it. And I think the channel that I've kind of found is through, it's kind of like a leadership training. I see leadership training as a gateway drug to the true ecstasy of multiple worldviews, and so there's a lot of work there. I think that's really needed and very alive, and many of you have already spoken to. So combined with sort of multiple worldviews, with different ways of knowing, and our relationship with nature, with patient capital, and I think we can have a really a true impact in the world. So I'm very excited about that. And I've been working closely with Greg, Katie, and by extension, Jamaica and Charlie for a few months now. And I'm seeing that we could truly be and do something really special here together. Thank you.
One of the things that has come to mind, I'll take off my facilitator hat for just a moment and share some things that have been indigenous to my work as a financial advisor. Well, people come into my offices over the last 25, 30 years and invest in mutual funds of stocks and bonds because that's what's available to people coming into a major investment bank or a traditional investment firm. And so much of those investments are not investing in the actual community. So for example, here where I live in Los Angeles, people are buying into stocks of companies that have stores here, but they're not able to buy into the local businesses, the farmers markets, the community projects, other than maybe a municipal bond here or there. But what would it look like to take, in California, we have $1 trillion of 401k plans from people checking the box of their office and putting their money in their jobs into a retirement plan, but that's all in the global casino. So the theory is, how do we take that $1 trillion and redirect even 1 to 5% of that back into community-based investments, and then to cultivate the capacity for communities to receive investments in the 400 cities across California, is the kind of thing that is speaking to me as what opportunities are before us, to weave all of us together place by place to look at a critical mass of projects that could receive capital on an institutional scale. And coordinating it so that there's a little bit of venture equity, but not necessarily the venture capital model, but community equity model. And what Jenny and you were working on, what we were talking about with CoCap, but then adding those loans, those business loans and real estate loans and mortgages and infrastructure, all that could be put together in the manner that we're talking about. So this is the kind of very rich conversation that if we take all of our perspectives and put it into one place, that is the kind of rich ecosystem of thought and initiatives and relationships that the resources can come through. That is the promise of us coming together in this beautiful way. And we are a community. So they'll put my facilitator hat back on. For those of you who normally don't make a comment. So for those of you who are very thoughtful about these things, but are a little more shy, is there something that you want to say? And I'm going to follow Jamaica's lead by just creating a space for those of you that are maybe not comfortable to speak, but you know you have something to say. And just to take a step and share with us your wisdom and your gift. Any of you that haven't spoken thus far. Maybe a question for you, what you want to hear all of us speak about. Anybody? Just, you don't even need to raise your hand, just share your thoughts and be bold.
Gregory.
Thank
Hi.
you.
I'll be bold. Hi, Mitchell Rabin here. My friend Lauren Archer just told me about this, so I just kind of jumped in as soon as I learned about this gathering, and I've been listening intently. So interesting. I did share in the chat a note of something that I think could bear relevance to what I'm hearing, some of the issues. We all have issues in raising money for the projects that we feel are near and dear to our hearts, green ones, eco-friendly, reforestation, protecting indigenous communities and the like. So I did respond to Deborah when she was talking, because I run a nonprofit called the Better World Foundation and the Better World Media, and I'm always fundraising for projects that will reduce the carbon footprint and, you know, move us into a renewable energy kind of economy, et cetera, et cetera. And man, I still have hair, but I'm pulling a lot out regularly because it's just so frustrating to try to speak to money people who are just about money, as you were saying before, and speak sensibly, like humanly, about the current situation of our planet. And many of them go, yeah, but they don't really want to hear it. They're number crunchers. And it's very frustrating. And I think everybody here probably has had some experience like that. It happens that very ironically, I'm working with some money people who have a much greener worldview now. I think I'm helping them a little bit about that because I keep feeding them technologies that are here for energy efficiency, reducing carbon footprint, blah, blah, blah. And they're taking to these things. Well, they in turn have turned me on to the whole world of carbon credits. It's an interesting sort of a slightly double, mixed blessing. On one hand, it's the democratization of money, like I sort of heard Charlie talking about a little bit, because through that, when people are stewards of their land for long periods of time and helping to nurture old growth and reducing and minimizing development, that land is becoming very valuable from a carbon credits point of view. So much so that I tell people I now feel like a green Santa Claus, because when people have land, and it works for buildings too, that's a whole other thing, but just talking about land, hundreds or thousands of acres, through what I'm doing with this small group, we are generating carbon credits, and that will help indigenous communities fund land that they are the caretakers of and have been for, God knows, centuries. And now they are becoming the recipient of funds that are sorely needed. I'm working on a project right now in Panama that speaks to that. These people who are they're hungry. Indigenous people are getting paid $15 a day. It costs them $6 just to go to work and come back. They're feeding their families on $9 a day. It's untenable. And through what we're doing, we're going to be able to bring, and they're, as a result, overfishing, overhunting, and cutting down trees. It's unnecessary. We can change that scenario. So I'm just telling you this and sharing this with everybody, that there are ways. The mixed blessing part of it is that the corporations that are paying the bucks ultimately to us, to stewards, are using the carbon credits to offset polluting practices, and no one here like that. So, you know, there's a risk to reward ratio with everything, and that's one of the ones I'm kind of dealing with right now. But at the end of the day, we know there's so much propaganda around this and greenwashing that if we can recognize that, but make use of the money and the resources for good, I have decided, at least for myself, that it's well worth it. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. There's a session on Thursday called Beyond Carbon where we can look at some of these dimensions as well. But thank you so much for sharing some of that and the perspective.
I'll put my info in the chat if anybody wants to reach out to me.
Yeah. So for me, what I hear so many of this is that each of us hold an important piece. And by us being what the title of this session calls forth, funding cooperative methods for funding community resilience, I just imagine what it would be like if we all cooperated to coordinate each of our respective communities of practice, or places that you might call communities as well, into something very cooperative. And I think that's one of the greatest promises of this gathering and what we're all doing and why we all came together on this magical day. I think there's no mistake, they say, that we are all here together. Everyone who's here is meant to be here. And in the time that we have left, I want to hand it back to Katie for a few minutes, and then maybe we have closing comments and closing insights. And John, we'll call out to you in a moment after Katie. How do we want to spend the remaining 10 minutes? And maybe you can just bring us home.
Yeah, let's maybe hear John's perspective first, and then I can do some weaving.
Great, thank you. Anything else that's hanging as well from anybody else? Hi, John.
Hi, I'm outside my zone of competence, which is why I've been sort of quiet. But I do have some questions and thoughts. Maybe I should have asked them earlier. We're complaining about investment, but for most of us, and certainly for most financiers, investment implies the probability of return on investment. You're asking for money. It's a good investment if you have a good shot at getting more money back. I haven't really heard. I understand that that's also the root of all evil and part of the reason why things are as fucked as they are. But I haven't heard the alternative model that helps us talk about investment appropriately. I am familiar with Commonwealth's 4 returns notion, but I think that's a weakness of their formulation, is that it's a nice idea, but it's hard for me to believe that people are investing money without expecting a return on investment. So it's a puzzle.
It is a puzzle.
The other side,
the term funding instead of investing, because we all have access to funds, not all of us, but there is the idea of funding, which has a different goal. It prioritizes the project, where investment prioritizes the return to the investor. So those are the distinctions I heard in that.
I do get that, and certainly in the philanthropic world, I understand that. But of course, it's somewhat parasitic on the profitable world, and so it's not a pretty picture. And I'm not complaining to this group, but I am complaining because I feel that we're stuck here. But I do want to say that I think many people on this call have some discretionary money and capital of their own, and they've invested enough time here that there's a good chance that they actually share these kinds of values. Although I'm going to guess they're also fairly cautious with what they do with the wealth that they have. I'm wondering whether, whatever you want to call it, a funding pool or an investment pool, however small, stocked, filled by a group like us, might be able to begin exploring and modeling what it would mean to put our money where our mouth is. I don't have a lot of money, but I have a little that I would invest in an experiment of this sort. And if I had other people more competent financially to help figure out how to do it, we might learn something. So that's just a possible action item to follow from all of this interesting theory.
And there's a lot of great examples of those kind of collective funds. And Jenny, I know you're raising your hand. I know the Force for Good Fund, we only have a few more minutes, but thank you, John, for raising thought-provoking challenges. Important. And Jenny, closing thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to that great comment, which, and, you know, there's a lot of different ways of looking at this, but in my view, you know, I love Chris's cat, by the way. In my view, there are wonderful activities that can happen that provide wonderful support to all stakeholders that do generate some amount of profit in the world of, you know, the late stage capitalism that we live in now. So I don't think it's impossible for wonderful ventures that we love, that are contributing so many positive things to the world, to generate some amount of profit that could, a portion of which could be paid to investors. So I don't think we have to give up the idea of a return on investment to do things in a regenerative way. There's so many examples of projects that do pay a return on investment. I think the big question is, when people say market rate return, what the hell do they mean by that? You know, in the world of venture capital, market rate return is like 35% internal rate of return. But guess what? In reality, the average VC fund doesn't even pay anything back. They lose money. So we need to just be so much more clear about what is a reasonable market rate return and what is risky. Is it risky to invest in our own communities and the businesses that we love and that we go to every single day? Maybe not, you know. So I think there's no problem with the idea of a return on investment. The problem is just how do we define what is a just and reasonable return on investment and what is risky?
Yeah, it's a great response. I would like to benefit from the wisdom of a group like this in identifying those opportunities.
Thank you, John. There are many. And, you know, resilience is a different thing than return. But then if it's resilient, it does provide resources and prosperity, and that shared prosperity is the goal. Thank you so much, everybody, for your thoughts and what you did not say that you were contributing as well. And Katie, back to you. We have 5 minutes, right?
Yeah, thank you, Greg, and thank you all for participating in this emergent container. I think we went into this thinking, you know, it might be more kind of funding folks talking about examples, and then we saw the space and recognized that there were so many projects in the room too that it felt right to open that up into more of a dialogue instead. And I will admit that, John, kind of what you'd pointed to was actually one of my greatest secret hopes as the outcome of a session like this one, that, you know, we're spending 3 days showcasing a bunch of incredible projects, and we have folks in the room that have the capacity to fund. And what would it look like to start modeling some of these pools together? I think that that's well within our reach, and that collectively we have the resources and infrastructure to do so. And so I would love to examine immediate opportunities for us to model that collectively in ways big and small. I know that we already have a handful of specific sessions over the next 2 days that are modeling some of our opportunities to do that. Tomorrow, there's a direct invitation for projects that are working in ecological restoration and in regen ag food systems to enter such kind of a shared pooled funding model. So I encourage participation in some of those sessions tomorrow. But I think that more broadly, what we're seeing and what it was really heartening, especially watching the chat and seeing some of Penelope and Jamaica and Emmanuel's contributions, you know, I think a thread that I've been hearing across all of the conversations that I've been in today, and certainly within this one, has been that, to bring back in one of John's points, I think there is a fallacy that, impact is contrary to a return. And I actually think that if we can truly find ways to cooperate well together, that even by the most stark kind of existing capital market sort of constraints, that is a wiser investment, because you're investing in a project that has a supportive shared learning community around it that's benefiting from shared resources, where you can have sort of ecosystems that are perhaps bioregionally diversified, that are diversified by projects. You're much better off investing in a project that's in sort of this shared collaborative pool with meaningful kind of value and knowledge exchange than you are betting on something and hoping that it's a unicorn, right? And so that's, I think, the case that we're looking to model, certainly, in the convenings we're having over these next couple of days, as well as moving forward. And I would love to invite specific opportunities for those in this room. There'll be some follow-up conversations from this week. And so it seems that we have sufficient kind of interest for one of those to be around, what type of experiment might we be able to run together. And I'll also admit that I've been wanting to model some of these kind of shared pool experiments for a while, looking at, for some time, for example, I found myself getting asked to facilitate or participate in these retreats, for example, okay, high net worth individuals are coming together and we're going to collectively figure out how to steward our wealth towards impact. And that to me seemed like a flawed premise in and of itself, because that holding of wealth, I think, can harm those that inherit it. It harms those that inherit wealth. It harms those that, lack access to that wealth. I think that there's, a paradigm shift there around how we can kind of start to unlock this value as this neutral tool that we can collectively apply. And so one of my initial, I think, kind of more naive conclusions out of that was, well, let's just have everybody put in X dollars and we'll run an experiment and then we'll collectively steward which projects we put them into. But something I started to notice, and I think Emmanuel may have nodded to this a little bit as well, is that the second you put holders of financial capital in the room with projects, the projects start to contort themselves to take the shape that they think the funder wants. And so another piece that I've been really curious about is how do we create the right scaffolding, legal and social and otherwise, that simply better reflects and makes transparent the work that the projects are already doing, lets the project do the things the projects are doing, and measures their outcomes and their impacts, whether it's taking existing land-based projects that are already generating particular offsets, but might not be reflecting that and giving them market access in that way, or whether it's some other models that we're exploring, some of which we'll be sharing tomorrow, around better documenting work that's already in alignment with the mandates of the USDA or NEFA, so that we can unlock federal matching dollars for the activities that projects are already participating in, but they might not have some of those channels or know how to navigate ways to access those funds. And so I hope that was somewhat tangible, but I will say that, what we're working on are developing, tools and contexts that we hope can better make transparent the work that's already being done, so that the financial capital can then shape itself in a way to find the projects rather than the other way around. And I think that's also going to take, Jenny, to your earlier point, the right legal and social context to do so. I think that takes exploring new processes for sourcing projects from the grassroots up, and looking at metrics not in a punitive way, but in a way that is orchestrated and defined by communities around what they define that value as. And that also looks at legal stewardship models where we can actually start to have a legal fiduciary responsibility to mission rather than to quarterly shareholder earnings. And so we will also be touching on that a little bit in this afternoon session on, I forget the name of the session, Jamaica, but we'll be touching on
I'll
legal
put it
and
in the
social
chat.
models
It's
for
networking
community.
networks and looking at legal and social governance models for multi-level coordinating within the commons. So really looking at how we have that sort of shared social and infrastructure to allow for more cooperative networks to connect and honestly build the participatory commons. So I'll put it in the chat here. That'll be our final session for the day.
Thank you. Yeah, so again, we have meetings or we have sessions each of the next 2 mornings that have pretty tangible invitations. There's a session on designing a center or convening a center for regeneration tomorrow in the early afternoon Pacific time that will be a direct invitation for kind of projects and funders to start to come together to model some of this stuff. But we'll be following up with those who attended with future opportunities. Again, we're just scratching the surface of something that's so big. And I think all of you in this conversation who've been doing such tangible work in resourcing community resilience over decades. And I look forward to learning from you all. Thank you. We're about to head into a little bit of a pause here. Our next session is until 3:30. So
Snack break for those of you who've been with us all day. It's a little snack break before we do our final session of the day. And Greg, I'll let you jump into, but tomorrow, like Katie said, we kick off our theme. We'll have another morning community session and opening session with the Guild of Future Architects, which was so beautiful this morning to start the day. And then we'll be in a series of different discussions, very dynamic ones on regen ag and food systems and hunger and nutrition. And I'm really thrilled for tomorrow's lineup. And then the third day will be eco restoration and climate action. There's some really beautiful conversations happening that day as well, along with some very practical and tangible conversations. So for this, Greg, please go ahead, but as a moderator, I'll let you close out, but I'll just say, we'll just take a short break here, probably leave the room open, but turn everything off and then restart for the 3:30 session finally is today. But I'm just so grateful for the rich day. You kind of never know when you call people in, when you put the call out, you never know how that goes. And I'm blown away by the amount of wisdom and insight and presence and capacity and amazing projects that were shared today. And just so honored and thank you to be in community with you all and hold this space together. But great, please go ahead and then we'll kind of close the session out officially.
Thank you. I just saw your notes, Jamaica, about what's the next session at 3:30 about networking networks. And I'm just reminded of what one of my mentors, Hazel Henderson, said to me, Greg, your network is your net worth. And that really helped me to see the incredible wealth that we have right here among ourselves. And the more we can bond that way is really what she always held and what I see you carrying on and we're all living in. So I'll say, until then, I'm going to go grab a snack.
Not great.
And I celebrate the kitties as well.
Thanks, everybody.